Hey, we got an interesting hangout today, and I have Dustin Segers, who is backed by popular demand. I got a lot of messages about asking me, when are you and Dustin Segers going to do a hangout together again? Because they like watching our hangouts in the past. So I guess now you have the answer to your question. Dustin was willing to come on here and discuss this video by Ozzy that was published in, I think, August or July of 2014. Basically, he quoted some of our clips from some of the videos that we've been in, and then responded to them. I did respond sometime last year to some of these objections, but I didn't directly address the video to Ozzy, so to speak, although I think I did mention him. But this video is going to be a direct response to Ozzy, because I've had a couple people ask me to do this, so I decided I'll just go ahead and do it. But prior to having this video, prior to this hangout starting, I had a very disappointing conversation with Ozzy. Apparently, he was intent on, for some reason, calling me a liar. I guess he was upset because I didn't notify him about that I was going to be doing a video response to him. Whereas I did notify him, and then I told him I did see where I had the message sent on YouTube. And then he says that he didn't receive it, which, I'll give him a benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he didn't receive it. But he still insisted on repeatedly trying to call me a liar. So in this video, I'm going to show my screen so that we can all watch the video that he posted in 2014. And also, I'm just going to real quick, just so he knows that I did send it. If he is watching, I'll just show him the message quickly. If I can remember how to do this. I tell you what, Dustin, I don't really know much about Google Hangouts. There we go, screen share.
Thank you.
What's this will be? Well, that's a really cool effect, isn't it?
That's awesome.
Okay, so this right here, can you see my screen, Dustin?
Yes.
Okay, you see here where I messaged him about, I think it was on Thursday afternoon or something. After I talked to you, Dustin, about doing this hangout, I told him that I was going to be responding to his video. I showed him which one, and I said the event would be and I showed him where the event would be hosted. One of his friends, I guess, showed up and tried to say that I didn't let him know about this event, which I did, as you can see here.
Right.
After Dustin, after I said that I had sent him a message and that I had a screenshot of it, he responded back by saying, "Oh, it's really easy to alter those things, so I'm not going to provide a screenshot. I'm just showing the actual message, so he can't accuse me of photoshopping or anything."
Move your cursor around a little bit, your mouse, just so that that's not.
Oh, yeah. Okay, see that?
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, yeah, so this is actually the message. And like I said, if Ozzy didn't receive it, then I'm willing to give him a benefit of doubt. Maybe he didn't. I mean, I had to look up how to check my messages on YouTube so I could go back here and look at the sent folder to make sure I did send it. I tried to message him the first time I tried to do a video because I was planning on mentioning him. And he said he didn't receive it. And that time, when I went back to check, I did not see it in my outbox. So I don't know what happened the first time I tried to notify him. But this time I do have the message here. So,
right. Pretty clear.
Yeah, well, I'm really disappointed. He comes off as such a cool-headed individual, and I had respect for him up until the day. But just insisting on calling someone a liar. I mean, if you're going to make that kind of accusation, you need to be able to demonstrate it.
That's over the top for sure.
Yeah, and he can, and he didn't. He may say, "Well, I didn't have the message the first time," but as he should know, since he claims to know so much about philosophy, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Indeed.
But maybe, I don't know. Maybe this is an emotional issue for him for some reason. But let's go ahead and get to the substance of the matter and look at this video that Ozzy had posted in July of 2014. He has also, if anyone wants to know the context, he does have the links that he pulled from. He was kind enough to provide that. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, Dustin, just so you know, I reviewed most of this video today, maybe about 2/3 of it, perhaps. I hadn't watched it in a while, and most of the first part of it is just him playing our clips, and then him explaining, you know, what affirming the consequent is, or I say asserting the consequent.
Right.
So, if you ever want me to stop, Dustin, just feel free to let me know, and I'll pause it.
Sure.
All right, here we go.
Hi, Ozzy here. In the last few weeks, I've heard some Christian presuppositionalist apologists in Hangouts and in online discussions claiming that science is based upon a fallacy known as the fallacy of affirming the consequent. In this video, I want to explain why this claim is mistaken. And if you're not familiar with what this fallacy is, don't worry, I'm going to explain it in detail. Now, before I begin, I want to mention two things. First, uncharacteristically for me, I'm going to be playing 3 brief video clips from 2 recent Hangouts where this claim about science was made, so viewers can see and hear for themselves that I'm not setting up a straw man. Links to the original videos with timestamps will be included in the description box of this video, so people can view the originals and assure themselves that nothing's been taken out of context, and the views of these gentlemen have not been misrepresented. The other point I want to make is that there are, in fact, all sorts of difficult, thorny issues when it comes to scientific methodology and the enabling assumptions at the very heart of science. Everything from Hume's problem of how to justify induction, to the nature and types of causation, to how scientific theories are always underdetermined by evidence, to how we demarcate between science and pseudoscience, and much more. I would never want to minimize the seriousness of the issues which logicians, epistemologists, philosophers of science, sociologists of science, and even scientists themselves have brought to light about the nature, the limits, and the assumptions informing the scientific enterprise. There are genuine problems enough that we needn't invoke non-existent ones. So here's the first clip where an apologist, Dustin Segers, describes what he sees as a formal fallacy at the heart of all science, with an example he uses drawn from evolutionary theory. And here he's explaining very candidly why he thinks evolutionary theory is false.
One of the reasons you notice that I gave 3 reasons. Number 1, we believe it doesn't fit with the evidence. Number 2, it contradicts theological standards that we would hold to, namely the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And number 3, and this is one of the biggest problems, is that neo-Darwinian theory is built on, as is any scientific theory, is built upon logical fallacies. Let me give you an example. The most common one that is often ignored is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And here's how it goes. It's the idea that if evolution is probably true, we would expect to observe homology. Homology is, for instance, a frog has 5 fingers, a radius, a ulna, a scapula, a clavicle. We have 5 fingers, a radius, a ulna, a scapula, humerus, collarbone, just like the frog does. And so they would say, see, common design or common morphology, common structure, similar structure demonstrates and is consistent with, is evidence that is just added to the pile in support of evolutionary theory to show that we came from a common ancestor. And so they would say, okay, therefore evolution is probably true, most likely true, or the greater preponderance of evidence is consistent with, one of those being homology, that evolution is the case. What we say is, no, that's a logical fallacy. If P then Q, Q, therefore P. No, that's called affirming the consequent. And that's been long recognized as a fallacy. And atheist, secular, and humanist philosophers of science have long pointed this out. Started with David Hume. And this type of reasoning behind scientific investigation as far as it's related to cosmology, the origin of life, really took off after the Enlightenment. Before then, scientists didn't engage in this type of thing to the extent that it is now. They didn't engage in these tissue of logical fallacies, but that theory in and of itself can never be true simply because of the fact that it's built on at least three logical fallacies: the fallacy of affirming the consequent, the problem of induction, and then the third one is empiricism. Empiricism is fatally flawed. But the first one is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. You cannot determine what's true simply because of mere inductive observations. Just because we see cells changing and adapting to their environments today, and we see organisms doing the same through the process of speciation, natural selection, geographic pressures, artificial selection, whatever that may be, that does not prove that we all came from a rock.
Dustin, do you remember that hangout where you were speaking in?
Yeah, I do actually.
Do you remember the context of that?
The context was a fellow that came in to the Bible Thumping Wing podcast, this Google Hangout, and it was Google Hangout.
Yeah, your mic's sort of messing up.
Sorry about that. Is that
Sorry.
better?
No, not really.
Oh, let me see if I can put it up a little bit here.
You talked about changing your voice before going on the hangout. Is this what you had in mind?
Not at all. Let me see if I can cut this up just a little bit.
All right. That sounds better.
A little bit better.
Okay, not really.
Okay. Let me see here. Sorry about that.
Sounds like you're auto-tuning.
How about there?
No, you're still auto-tuning.
Okay. I'll tell you what. Let me come off here and I'll come right back in.
Sure. I'm just going to run my mouth while you're gone.
Okay. Sorry about that.
All right. Yeah, I just want to say something while we're waiting on him to come back and have the issue fixed. I've not watched very many of Ozzy's videos. I watched some of them. I know it's less than 10. But from what I understand, though, he talks a lot about the history of philosophy. But one thing that everybody needs to understand is that knowing something about the history of philosophy does not necessarily make you a good philosopher. There is a difference between studying the history of philosophy and actually doing philosophy. You do philosophy when you're arguing. It still sounds bad. You don't have a different mic you use or anything, do you?
Can you hear me?
Try again.
This is really weird.
Yeah, it's kind of still doing it.
Hello.
That's better. I think that's better. Try it again. Well, anyway, there's a difference between the history of knowing the history of philosophy and actually be able to do philosophy well. One central thing that you have to be able to do whenever you are doing philosophy and arguing for a point is represent your opponent's view correctly. And in some of this video here, I saw some instances where it seems that Ozzy, for whatever reason, came off a point or did not quite understand everything that Dustin and I were saying. Dustin, you want to try talking really quickly?
Yeah. How do I sound now?
Sounds good. All right.
Okay.
So why don't you go ahead and just give us what you remember about that conversation that he played?
Yeah. Well, the point that I was trying to make is not necessarily the way that some philosophers of science have tried to save the scientific method, or have, say, as Ozzy does, presents the scientific method as modus tollens. You know, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, or something like that. You know, if that's the case, then I don't really have a problem with it. But that's not the way scientists work. That's not the way they normally do it. So I was trying to present my information in a way that was consistent with what I'd observed and what I'd even heard some scientists use in the scientific literature. I work in a research-based field. I work in physical therapy and athletic training, and I appeal to scientific research all the time. So I have to use the scientific method almost daily in my enterprise. And I can tell you that with what we do, these types of claims are made all the time. For instance, the claim that I made was, for example, in other words, the example I gave was, if evolution is probably true, then we'd expect to observe homology. That's exactly what most Darwinists that I have interacted with say. They'll observe an experiment and they'll say, well, we observe homology. The conclusion and evaluation is therefore evolution is probably true. That is based upon the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. If all science was engaged in was falsification and probability, I wouldn't have a problem. But that's not the claims that are often made, right, especially when it comes to those that philosophize about science, namely internet atheists and even some popular atheists like Richard Dawkins. Another problem too is that atheist philosophers, mathematicians, and logicians themselves have recognized that the fallacy of affirming consequent and the problem of induction are invoked regularly as an appeal to show the truthfulness of science. But Bertrand Russell said this, he said, quote, all inductive arguments in their last resort reduce themselves to the following form. If this is true, that is true. Okay, so if P, then Q. Now that is true, okay, that's Q. Therefore, this is true. That's P. That's the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Russell goes on to say this argument is, of course, formally fallacious. Suppose I were to say if bread is a stone and stones are nourishing, then this bread will nourish me. Now this bread does nourish me, therefore it is a stone and stones are nourishing. If I were to advance such an argument, I should be certainly thought foolish, yet it would not be fundamentally different from the argument upon which all scientific laws are based. In science, we always argue that since the observed facts obey certain laws, therefore other facts in the same region will obey the same laws. We may verify this subsequently over a greater or smaller region, in other words, using the inductive method, but its practical importance is always in regard to those regions where it's not yet been verified. We verify the laws of statics, for example, in countless cases, and we employ them in building a bridge. In regard to the bridge, they're not verified until we find the bridge stays up. But their importance lies in enabling us to predict beforehand that the bridge will stay up. It's easy to see why we think it will. It's merely an example of Pavlov's conditioned reflexes, which cause us to expect whatever combinations we have frequently experienced in the past. But if you have to cross a bridge in a train, it's no comfort to you to know why the engineer thought it was a good bridge. The important thing is that it should be a good bridge, that this requires that his induction from the laws of statics and observed cases to the same laws in unobserved cases should be a valid one. Now, unfortunately, no one has hitherto shown any good reason for supposing that this sort of inference is sound. Hume, nearly 200 years ago, threw doubt upon induction, as indeed upon most other things. The philosophers were indignant and invented refutations of Hume, which passed muster on account of their extreme obscurity. Indeed, for a long time, philosophers took care to be unintelligible, since otherwise everybody would have perceived that they had been unsuccessful in answering Hume. It's easy to invent a metaphysic which will have as a consequence that induction is valid, and many men have done so, but they've not shown any reason to believe in their metaphysic except that it was pleasant. The metaphysic of Bergson, for example, is undoubtedly pleasant like cocktails. It enables us to see the world as a unity of abstract distinctions, and all of it vaguely agreeable. But no better claim than cocktails have to be included in the technique for the pursuit of knowledge. There may be valid grounds for believing in induction, and in fact, none of us can help believing in it, but it must be admitted that, in theory, induction remains an unsolved problem of logic. As this doubt, however, affects practically the whole of our knowledge, we may pass it by and assume pragmatically that inductive procedure with proper safeguards is admissible. So what is Russell saying here? Russell is saying that all arguments, as I've read, I'm sorry for the long quote, but he's making my point that all inductive arguments in the last resort reduce themselves to the following form. If this is true, that is true. If P, then Q. Now that is true, therefore this is true. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Not only is that invoking the problem of induction, which is begging the question, so that's logically fallacious. It can't be true because you don't have justified or warranted true belief, so you can't have knowledge that the claim is true, philosophically speaking. But secondly, as Russell, the atheist, points out, that this is based on the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. In other words, if evolution is true, then we would expect to observe homology. We observe homology, therefore evolution is probably true. So that was the background for the conversation that I had with this atheist that called into the Bible Thumping Wingnut show. That's the point that I was making. So I hope that's helpful.
Well, one thing, whenever Ozzy did the video at the very beginning, he said, I heard some Christian apologists recently claim, and I think that such a statement like that leaves the impression that we just that Christian apologists just recently started saying things like that. I had been saying that for a while, and certainly you can go back to the 20th century and find Christian philosophers that said the same thing.
Right.
Like Gordon Clark, John Robbins, Gary Crampton, Kenneth Talbot, maybe I think Ronald Nash possibly too.
Yes, these statements have been made for a long time. These claims have been made for a long time, and all we've simply done is we've plundered the Egyptians. We've looked at, for instance, the British atheistic philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who argued that science, rather than being a body of proven truths, as many believe, is really nothing but guessing and refuted guessing. And here's his quote on that quote. First, although in science we do our best to find the truth, we're conscious of the fact that we can, or conscious, I should say, of the fact that we can never be sure whether we've got it. We know that our scientific theories always remain hypotheses. In science, there is no quote-unquote knowledge in the sense in which Plato and Aristotle understood the word. In other words, as justified true belief. In the sense which implies finality, in science, we never have sufficient reason for the belief that we have attained the truth. Einstein declared that his theory was false. He said that it would a better approximation to the truth than Newton's, but he gave reasons why he would not, even if all predictions came out right, regard it as a true theory. That is from Popper's Selections, Princeton University Press, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying that science isn't useful. That's not the point. But I'm saying that when we come to issues that relate
your mic's messing up again.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I have a short in the wire.
I think it may have just stopped.
Okay. Am I back?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to make the point that when it comes to people constructing their arguments in support of any particular theory, say, for instance, the theory of origins, that theory has to be constructed in a logically appropriate, philosophically valid way. And the soundness of those premises must be determined by the Word of God when it comes to origins. Because anything beyond that is going to be speculation and guessing, as Popper ultimately said. As Bertrand Russell said, it's based on the inductive principle, which is based on the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, and begging the question when it comes to using the inductive method. And the inductive method is necessarily going to use, if this is true, then we would expect to observe this. Well, we observe that, therefore this is probably true. That is a fallacy of affirming the consequent. Even if you put the scientific method in the form of modus tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, is simply falsification, that can never tell you what's true. It can only tell you what's false. And that's what I've argued all along anytime I've had this conversation, that science can only do two things ultimately. It can only show you what works, which is fine, and then it can show you what's false. It can also posit what's maybe likely true or possibly true in principle, but it can never tell you what's absolutely true or certainly true. And I know Ozzy would agree with that latter part.
Yeah. But anyway, though, so we've established too that not that it even matters or that it should even be worth mentioning, but it's not just Christian apologists that are saying this. It's been for a long time, and this isn't some new thing that Christians just started saying. There have been Christians that have been saying this for a long time. So this is just this. I just don't want anyone to think that based off of what Ozzy said, that this is just some new thing that just suddenly came up and has become popular. It's been around for quite a while.
Yeah, we're not making this stuff up.
No, we can demonstrate it, and that's the point. And as we're going to see as we move on through here, Ozzy's defense of the scientific method being able to lead to knowledge is indefensible. I'm going to go ahead and play through the rest of it, or at least more of it. Let him go through my quotes, and then I'll give some context to that. Unless you have anything else to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Time for the cool screen effect again. There we go. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Look at that go down. We're looking at the actual world and then possible worlds. No, I'm just kidding.
There you go. The Matrix.
They all look the same. Maybe God really is sovereign. All right, I'll go ahead and play through this now.
So he mentioned three problems. the problem of how to justify induction without begging the question of induction's reliability, and that is a genuine problem. The issue of empiricism, and I'd agree with him that a pure and strict empiricism is naive and incorrect. And lastly, he mentions the formal fallacy of affirming the consequent. Before going on to the next clip, my next apologist, I just want to call attention to a couple of things. The first is that although he has chosen to illustrate the fallacy of affirming the consequent using an example drawn from evolutionary theory, if he's correct, it would not be limited to evolution, but would be equally applicable to all of science. Indeed, he flatly stated it was a fallacy that infects all of science. The second thing I want to call attention to is a minor mistake he makes. It was probably nothing more than a slip, but strictly speaking, it's a fallacy, and it's a very common one which everyone in the great debate needs to recognize. You'll recall he said that because the theory rests on fallacies, it can never be true. That claim that some proposition or belief or theory or position cannot be true if it's based on a fallacious argument is false. That in and of itself is a fallacy. In fact, it's called the fallacy fallacy. The reason this is a fallacy is because the fact that some position or claim is being argued for on the basis of faulty reasoning, even atrocious reasoning, does not imply that the position or claim is false. One could present a bad argument for anything, even something manifestly true, but one can't infer that the position or claim is false just because someone is relying on a bad argument to support that position or claim. It's very common for people to think that pointing out a fallacy is sufficient to refute the conclusion.
All right, he greatly erred in this respect. Did you hear what he did, Dustin?
Yeah. I mean, I will grant to him that it's true that it would have been better for me to say evolution may be true in principle, logically speaking, but you can't prove it's true by using logically fallacious arguments. I mean, that was my point. Wasn't
the context of your conversation with that atheist concerning epistemology?
Yeah, it was totally concerning epistemology, that you cannot know.
He should have looked at the context more carefully. I know he said he provided the links, and I suppose that's a good thing. But if Ozzy wishes to be, to be recognized as someone who's competent in doing philosophy, he needs to represent the opposition correctly. This is not, whether something's true or false is a metaphysical issue. When we're talking about science being false because it rests on the fallacy of asserting the consequent, we're not talking about that it's always every proposition we're going to conclude in science is going to be false.
No.
That is not what we're claiming. The reason why we say science, why all these propositions of science must be considered false, is because one cannot simply infer that we can know something is true based off of a fallacy in logic. Because if you do, then you are basically denying the rules of inference and logic, and that will cause logic to break down. If someone were to say that they could show that something is true by asserting the consequent, despite the fact that it's a fallacy, and let me also explain why asserting the consequent is a fallacy. Asserting the consequent assumes that there's only one antecedent that correlates with the consequent, or we could say in the realm of empiricism or empirical study, there's only causal relation between that antecedent and that consequent, and there could be no other explanation for why we observe the consequent.
Right.
And that is false. And if someone were to say, well, I can show that evolution is true because of homology, and they were to insist on that despite approaching it in a way by asserting the consequent, then logic breaks down, because if we can just claim any cause we want to for what we observe, then everything's fair game.
Right. Space aliens.
Right. I mean, everything looks, like for instance, if, and Richard Dawkins has said that things do look as designed. Now, he's not affirming design. He's just saying it does look, things do look sort of like the design, but it's an illusion.
Right.
Right. But we could tell him, well, we think it's space aliens.
Right.
And there would be nothing he'd be able to say if he said that we could know things just by arguing for it by asserting the consequent. Then not only is the argument valid, but there's no way of showing that it isn't sound. And in order to show it sound, you could appeal to all these other evidences for that. such as design, the appearance of design, to show that aliens are the ones that designed us.
Right.
And so anyway, though, but whenever you deny logic, whenever you deny a rule of inference, whenever you insist that you can show something is true by virtue of asserting the consequent, logic goes out the window. And if logic goes out the window, then any empirical study is unintelligible.
If logic goes out the window,
right?
If logic goes out the window, then pizza sleeps fast under the west. The purple penguin weighs Friday. Therefore, the Mudge.
Yeah, exactly. I do wonder who came up with that. Did you come up with that?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's man. I would not want to hear that when I'm half asleep.
Yeah, but I do want to say this. I appreciate what he's trying to do here. Regardless of my disagreements with him, I appreciate what he's trying to do. I appreciate that he's trying to point out, or he's trying to make the game better, that he's trying to tighten up the thinking and make the thinking more clear and cogent. I like that. I mean, certainly, I would much rather say to the guy that I was speaking to on that show, evolution may be true in principle, logically speaking, but you can't prove or know it's true by using logically fallacious arguments. That was a point. That was only the point I was trying to make with this guy, because he was depending so much in the context of the conversation. I remember correctly, he depended quite a bit on how the supposed deliverances of science disprove Scripture, and therefore you can't trust Scripture. So I said, hold on a second. And he began talking about evolution, if I remember correctly. It's been a while, so you have to extend me some grace there, please. But I just want to make that point that,
like your microphone's acting up again.
Oh, wow.
Okay, now it's back, I guess.
That's weird. But I just want to make that point. I do appreciate the fact that he's trying to make the reason game better. He wants us to be tough-minded, and I think that's an admirable thing. But, on the other hand, I believe, rightly pointed out that there's significant problems with this. And I'm not the only one that's noticed this. I'm taking my cue from the Egyptians. In other words, I'm taking my cue from unbelieving secular scientists who have said this. I'm taking them from Hume. Hume focused on the problem of induction. Hume's problem's never been answered. Karl Popper's tried to give an explanation, but all he did was simply say, basically it was an argument from, well, we want it to work, therefore it works. Okay, well, that's not good enough. That's not going to answer the problem. So, and you know more about that than I do, but I specifically remember studying these things years ago, and I just came to the conclusion that we really don't have any reason to have any qualms whatsoever about our Bibles when it speaks to the issue of origins, when scientists make certain deliverances about what is certainly the case. Now, I know that Ozzy, as careful as he is not going to come out and say that evolution is certainly true. He is much more careful thinker than that. But I'm not talking about Ozzy in this case. I'm talking to a guy who called into a show who thinks that evolution is maximally certain based upon the so-called the interpretation of the scientific evidence. And when we get into those issues, I can point out how the thinking that's prevalent in that area, especially as it pertains to those atheists, especially internet atheists that hold to scientism, and even some popular atheists like Richard Dawkins that hold to scientism, I can point out how their method is based on logical fallacies. It's just a tissue of logical fallacies. And so that's the only thing I was trying to do. So I hope that's helpful to those that are listening.
Yeah, and while I do also appreciate Ozzy, trying to get everybody to raise the bar, when he does it, he needs to at least represent the person correctly.
Yeah.
Because otherwise he's just compounding the problem. And I just thought whenever I listened to that clip, I thought the context was clear enough. I knew exactly what you were saying, but maybe that's because we have the same position.
It probably is, yeah.
But but like I said, though, Ozzy needs to be a little bit more careful and ask a few more questions. And then if the context of it's not clear, then he needs to ask the person that made the statement.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to do.
So, all right. Do you have anything else to add, or you want to go on to the video?
No, we can go ahead.
You want me to go ahead and play more?
Yeah, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Identifying a fallacy in an argument is a reason to reject the argument for a conclusion, not the conclusion itself. Now, I hasten to add here again that this gentleman very likely knows this, merely misspoke when he said that, that when he said that the fallacies he named, if those fallacies are present, it means the theory can never be true. He probably meant to say something like, such theories are unwarranted or not rationally justified if the conclusion rests only on fallacious arguments. Something.
See, Ozzy recognized that you didn't mean it that way. So so he did show some recognition there. Oh, I see that Dustin's not here anymore. Oh well, he'll be back, I'm sure. But Ozzy did say he said that Dustin probably knew that, and Dustin did. The context of that was so clear. I didn't see any reason for him to try and point that out, except for to try and clarify Dustin's position. He shouldn't. If he thinks Dustin knew that and wasn't actually trying to say that, then he should have approached that a bit differently. Whenever instead of just trying to posture himself as if he's trying to correct Dustin on something he said. So let's just keep going.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I just took the headset off.
What commercial is that? Can you hear me now from? Is that Verizon or Sprint?
I don't know, but it worked.
All right. Well, all right. Let's go ahead and get through more of this here. I think we're making pretty decent time.
To that effect. All right, on to the next clip, featuring another apologist, Jason Peterson this time, who's an acquaintance of the first, taken from...
I am not an acquaintance of Dustin. We're friends.
Amen.
All right, I'm going to keep playing.
You pedantic guy, you.
A more recent hangout he hosted on his own channel.
The second problem is that all experiments that are used to attempt to validate a hypothesis or a theory, such as evolution, commits the logical fallacy of asserting the consequent.
Affirming the consequent.
It's also called asserting the consequent too. There's two different ways you can call it. I just say asserting. I just think it sounds better. All right, for those, some people commented on this. Me saying that was actually a joke. That it sounds better. Asserting the consequent. I say asserting the consequent because it really is just asserting the consequent. It's saying and affirming the consequent that never really made a lot of sense to me. So, just so people who have been asking me about that know, that was kind of a joke. But I also just want to say I look like a Smurf. See how blue I am. That I have a big computer screen, and when there's a lot of blue on, it just kind of reflects on me. So anyway. I'm going to go ahead and keep playing through now. But asserting the consequent would be the fallacy that science commits. So if you're going to try and say that you can derive some justified true belief from a standpoint of a philosophy that commits that fallacy in order to accept or reject the proposition, then I mean it seems to me that the first principle you're using doesn't really lead you to any sort of what you could call capital T truth, absolute truth. You get what I'm saying?
If you don't get what he's saying, he goes on to explain moments later when asked to elaborate.
You were asking me about how science commits asserting the consequent. What I mainly am focusing on in that instance is the way hypotheses are confirmed in science. If your hypothesis is correct, you should observe a certain phenomenon. If P implies Q, that's the first premise. Then the second premise is the phenomenon that I predicted happens. That's Q, right? So then you say, therefore, the hypothesis is confirmed. That's P, and that's the logical structure of asserting the consequent.
Okay.
So both these gentlemen are claiming that science, all science, not just evolutionary theory, rests on a fallacy called affirming the consequent. Okay, so what exactly is this fallacy of affirming the consequent? The fallacy of affirming the consequent is a formal deductive fallacy, which means that the fallacy has to do with the specific form or structure of a deductive argument. That is, the argument does not conform to a legitimate inference rule of deductive logic. The fallacy of affirming the consequent is a common violation of a rule of inference called modus ponens. Now, modus ponens is just a fancy Latin name for an inference rule of logic that you use every single day. And it goes like this. If A is true, then B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. Or more simply, premise 1, A implies B. Premise 2, A, thus B. And A and B can be any two propositions. So for instance, premise 1, if it rained, then the street is wet. Premise 2, it rained, therefore the street is wet. Simple enough. So the inference rule, modus ponens, tells us that B is true if A is true. But it says nothing about what is implied if B is true. So using modus ponens, that inference rule, we can infer B from A, but we can't infer A from B. The following would be incorrect, for instance, a violation of modus ponens. Premise 1, if it rained, then the street is wet. The street is wet, therefore it rained. The fact that the street is wet doesn't imply that it rained. The first premise doesn't tell us what we can infer if the street is wet. It only tells us what we can infer if it rained. There's nothing in the premises that warrant the conclusion. And that's why it's a violation of modus ponens. It's the fallacy of affirming the consequent. By contrast, any argument that follows the correct form, modus ponens, is logically valid. And what that means is that provided that an argument is constructed in that form, if the premises or assumptions are correct, then the conclusion also has to be correct. When an argument is presented in the correct way, in the correct form, conforming to an inference rule, such as modus ponens, there are others, the argument is called valid. It doesn't even matter, though, if the premises are false. Why do I say that? Well, here's an example. All men are bald. Ozzy is a man. Therefore, Ozzy is bald. That's a valid argument. It's valid because the conclusion follows from the premises. The premises entail or imply the conclusion. So this argument is valid. But note that the conclusion, Ozzy is bald, is false. A valid argument can have a false conclusion. The conclusion is true only if the premises are also true. Garbage goes in, garbage comes out. True premises go in, true conclusions come out. That's how validity works. So validity by itself does not ensure truth of a conclusion. And often when people say, well, such and such an argument is valid, or such and such an argument is invalid, they're actually meaning to say that the argument is sound, having not just a valid structure, which conforms to an inference rule of logic, but also has true premises, two conditions involved. And this is why in logic we say that a valid inference rule is truth preserving, meaning that if an argument conforms to a certain form, that will guarantee the truth of the conclusion, so long as the premises are true. If the form or structure of the argument is wrong, well, then it doesn't matter if the premises are true. The conclusion might be right or it might be wrong. All bets are off when the structure of the argument is invalid, which is why we want our arguments to be valid, conforming to truth-preserving inference rules of logic, and also based on true premises. So they'll be sound arguments. What you want is a sound argument, not one that is merely valid. So let's return to modus ponens with that in mind. The first premise, if A is true, then B is true, or rather, if A is true, then B is true, is what's called the conditional premise, or the hypothetical conditional premise, because it's an if-then statement. The conditional premise is composed of two parts. The first part, A, is called the antecedent of the conditional. That's the if part of the if-then conditional statement. And the second half, B, is called the consequent of the conditional. That's the then part of the if-then statement. The fallacy of affirming the consequent occurs when one mistakenly tries to affirm that because the consequent is true, the antecedent must be true. If the consequent is true, the antecedent must be true. You're affirming the consequent and making a conclusion that's incorrect. Remember that the conditional premise states that A implies B, and so we can infer B from A. But it tells us nothing at all about what follows from B. So we cannot, may not infer A from B, even if B is true. That would be fallacious reasoning, a form of argument that does not conform to the truth-preserving inference rule of most opponents. Now, the argument that the first apologist was objecting to is constructed as follows. If A, evolution is true, then B, we expect to observe homologies in the organisms. Second premise, B, we observe homologies in organisms, therefore A, evolution is true. That is, in fact, a case of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. But that's because he's decided what will be the content of the antecedent and what will be the content of the consequent. One could just as easily...
Before we go on, I just want I want everybody to pay very close attention to what he's about to do. This is not how to do philosophy.
Right.
I'm going to go ahead and play through it. I bet you know he's probably going to do.
I was just getting ready to say I want to jump in here in a minute. Go ahead.
Okay.
Construct the first premise this way, in reverse order. If A, we observe homology, then B, evolution is true. We observe homology, therefore evolution is true. That's a formally valid argument. There's no formal fallacy when the first premise, the conditional premise, is constructed this way. And this is the way anyone who knows any logic arguing for that conclusion would construct the argument.
I want to, before you jump in, Dustin, I want to lay out a basic principle that everybody should follow whenever they're trying to argue for anything. All right. Every worldview starts with an axiom. And from that axiom, we have presuppositions that flow from it by self-evident, self-evidently from the axiom itself, as well as theorems that are actually deduced from the axiom. Anytime you are arguing for a conclusion, you must be able to trace that conclusion all the way back to the axiom. Mm-hmm. It has to be logically consistent. That's the first test for truth. Is it logically consistent? As Christians, the second test for truth would be, does it conform to what the Bible says? Right. Because the Bible is our axiom. The Bible alone is the Word of God. In this instance, you cannot arrive at a conclusion via the scientific method by asserting the consequent. And then after you come to that conclusion, whenever you're arguing with somebody, simply rearrange the premises into modus ponens and argue that way. Because what's going to happen if I ask you, how do you know that that homology and evolution are connected? Then what's going to happen? You're going to appeal to the scientific method and say, well, this is how I found this out, and it's going to be based on asserting the consequent. But if you're trying to say that proposition is true based off of one of the propositions in the modus ponens argument is true based off of asserting the consequent, then you just go right back to the same fallacy. You're really asserting the consequent. All you're doing is, as what ironically Ozzy accused Dustin of doing, and that is trying to rearrange the content of the argument so that it appears to be a valid structure.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. There's another thing too, is that Ozzy said later in the video that I uncharitably misrepresented, and of course he implies that here, I uncharitably misrepresented scientists, or at least evolutionists, with my argument in arranging the antecedent and the consequent in this way. But here's the problem. This is how the scientific method works. Yep. I'll give you an example that anybody can pull up online. Darwin said in his Origin of the Species, if my theory be true, namely the idea of universal common ancestry, then we should expect an innumerable number of intermediate fossils that gradually go from simplest to more complex. Okay, that's his argument. And he would go on from there. He didn't in the book, but he did him not directly in that particular immediate context, but he went on to there to argue that we should observe this gradualism in the fossil record from simplest to complex. Therefore, my theory will be true. My theory of universal common ancestry. That's the exact same form of argument that I presented as logically fallacious. If evolution is true, we should expect to observe homology. Darwin said that if evolution is true, we should expect to observe gradualism in the fossil record. Okay? We observe gradualism in the fossil record. Therefore, evolution is true. That's exactly the method that they use. It's exactly the method that they use. This is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. P and Q is hypothesis prediction. If evolution is probably true, we expect to observe homology. My hypothesis is that there's universal common ancestry, and as a result, we would expect a frog, a water buffalo, human beings, etc., to have a radius and an ulnar in their forearm. We observe that they have a radius and an ulnar in their forearm. Therefore, this confirms my theory that if universal common ancestry is true, or evolution, then we would expect to observe homology.
And this is
evolution is probably true. That's exactly the method that they follow. Hypothesis and prediction, if P then Q. Okay, you observe an experiment. Homology, that's the Q part. That's confirming your supposed prediction. And then your conclusion and evaluation is, therefore, evolution is probably true. This is exactly the way the method works. I've got the scientific method posted right here in front of me.
And let's bring up another example, too. You heard, Dustin, all the constantly going back and forth in the nutritionalist community about whether chocolate's good for you or not.
Exactly.
Why would anyone suppose? I mean, why would anyone? Why would it be that they keep changing their opinion on whether chocolate is good for you or not? I'll tell you why. Because whatever they did the experiment initially, they observed a change in physiology, and they attributed it to chocolate. But it turns out that perhaps in that particular context of that experiment, they misattributed the change in the physiology of the person to being affected by chocolate, when in reality there was another effect. That's why science is. That's why you see these opinions in the news about science. You know, you'll hear one day, yoga is very good for you. Do 10 minutes a day, and it will make a difference. And then another one, you get another article that says, well, we actually need to do yoga more often than that, or a longer period than that. So, I mean, you see this all the time. And if we're talking empirically, it's easily, you know, there's a ton of evidence that we have that shows that, and we can even show logically, if we were taking the context of logic, we could empirically, we can show there's good evidence for the fallacy of asserting the consequent being a factor in this constant changing of the conclusions of science. But logically, we can demonstrate it by virtue of deductive methodology. So I also want to do this too. I want to reset the context, because I just have a feeling that if we do not, then we may inadvertently leave Ozzy room to backpedal if he were to respond to this. The context of the conversation that you had with that atheist concerning the scientific method, you were pointing out that this was not a flaw necessarily in the atheist argument, but in a flaw in the scientific method. If you want to try and claim that you can furnish any knowledge of the truth from the scientific method, that's the content. And so, in the event that someone comes along and tries to respond to this and says otherwise, we can let it be on the record that that's not true. You can look at the original video where Dustin said that, and you can look at this one and show that is the context of it. And I'll tell you this: if let's say for the sake of argument, Dustin, that we could make the scientific method work off of modus ponens. Let's just grant it for a second. All right, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Well, if that were the case, the only way that science could work off of modus ponens is if science is not based on observation.
Right.
So the knowledge of P leading to Q would have to be a priori, rather than a posteriori.
Right.
Because then if we had to exchange, if we had to like for instance, let's use an example. If it is raining, the road will be wet. It is raining, therefore the road will be wet. Well, empirically, if we were trying to figure out why the road, what causes the road to be wet,
we've got to engage in the inductive method. We've got to hypothesize. We have to predict. We have to observe an experiment. We have to come to a conclusion and evaluation to prove the second point of the premise, namely that the road is wet. How do we do that? We have to use the fallacy of affirming the consequent, engage in induction. Correct. And not just that, but let's just say, whenever someone's trying to figure out what some of the things that can make the road wet, if water get, maybe they have a hypothesis.
if water gets on the road, it's gonna be wet, you know, and rain's a form of water. So, so they would say, if the road is wet, then there will be water on it. There's water on the road, therefore it is wet, right? Yeah. But we don't have. But would any empiricist or anyone who supports that the scientific method lead to knowledge really try and argue that there's an a priori knowledge that water makes things wet? Or is that an opinion that is learned as one goes on? Because if it's a priori, if knowledge such as that is a priori, then it would seem that empiricism is false, because it would imply that man does not have a blank mind, the tabula rasa.
Right.
And it seems that Ozzy's not a strict empiricist. He said that I think he said early in the video that he rejects it, but this is just to add more to it, because some of these objections are also applicable to what Ozzy's trying to do as well. But I tell you that you cannot just simply come up with a proposition on the basis of an invalid argument. Argue that you know it's true, and then take the proposition that you say you know is true, and then reformulate that into a modus ponens sort of argument. Argue for it. That's just not true, and it's blatantly dishonest, and it's sloppy, and it's unacceptable. If I would hope that anybody that would try and argue like that in a university or seminary would get an F.
Right.
So.
Right.
Anything else you have to say on that portion?
No, I work in a science-based field, and I'll give you an example. The science doesn't work in a modus ponens method, nor does it work in a modus tollens method. They do the things that we've said that they do. I'll give an example. There's been a debate in the last few years whether drinking pickle juice can reduce the incidence of exercise-induced muscle cramps. Well, the research over the last 7 years in both the NATA journal, the National Athletic Trainers Association journal, and I believe the Sport Physical Therapy journal has gone back and forth and back and forth. And at the last conference that I went to regarding this issue, it was inconclusive. They said, we don't know. We think now that turmeric, you know, one of the main ingredient in mustard, is really the thing that's going to relate to this. But the guy that said that, he recognized there's a correlation, but there's not necessarily a causation. And I liked him. I went up and talked to him about this after the conference, and I said, you know, I've noticed that the research keeps going back and forth about the issue of pickle juice. And I said, you know, I think the reason is because the scientific method was never designed to give us certitude on anything. I said it's only designed at best to falsify and show us what works, and even possibly give us a high probability of something that may be true, but it's not necessarily true. He said, that's right. He said, absolutely. He said, it can never tell us what the truth is in a capital T sense. And that's all I'm trying to say. That's all I'm trying to say.
And it's worth noting, too, others will agree and say, yeah, it's supposed to be an approximation of the truth. But according to logic, you know, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, the law of contradiction, that which is an approximation of the truth is not the truth, because the truth can only be the truth. And so, therefore, any approximation of the truth, as far as both metaphysically and epistemologically, is false. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I just want to see the cool effect again. Give me just a second. All right, there we go. We got 1,000 jungle rooms. All right, so this is a website that has a very irritating format. That background's just too bright. But luckily,
that's so 1995-ish right there.
Yeah, well, I think this has been around for a long time. But hey, look, they at least made the text black. I'm glad they didn't choose yellow or white or something ridiculous like that. Right. I'm going to read these things. This is from a secular university. I use this link all the time because it's so clearly and concisely shows the nature of the scientific method. I'm just going to read through these very quickly, and then we'll go back to the video unless you have anything to add. All right, what science is not. First, science is not a process that can solve all kinds of problems and questions. The realm of science is limited strictly to solving problems about the natural world. Science is not properly equipped to handle the supernatural realm as such, nor the realm of values and ethics. 2, it is not a process that can ignore rules. Science must follow certain rules, otherwise it's not science. just as soccer is not soccer if its rules are not followed. This is one that Ozzy may want to visit based off of what he attempted to do with a scientific method. You just cannot rearrange premises, and that does not go along with the experience-based, the experiential basis or existential basis of the scientific method.
Right.
3, it is not a process that seeks the truth or facts. The goal of science is to come as close as we can to understanding the cause-effect realities of the natural world. It is never truth or facts. Truth and facts can mean different things to different people. I do have slight disagreement with this portion, but overall, though, it does hammer the point that science is only an approximation of the truth, and because of that, these people have sense enough to realize that it does not produce truths or facts, because it doesn't. I mean, how can it do it if it's not seeking them? But there are all kinds of things. It is not a process that attempts to prove things. It is not a process that can produce any kind of explanation, because these explanations must be potentially disprovable. And that's one of the reasons why we never know if we have the right explanation or not, because if it's possible for it to get disproven, it could be disproven in the future.
Yes.
It is not a process that produces certainties or absolute facts. It's not a process that can always be relied upon due to its objectivity and internal self-correction. That's speaking to sometimes people that do experiments or trying to get more funding for their lab, or they may have different motivations that are not about objectivity whenever they're doing their experiments. 8, it's not a process that is always properly used. It's not a process that is free from values, opinions, or bias. It's not a process in which the product is based on faith or belief. It's not a process in which one solution is good as another, or simply a matter of opinion. I disagree with that one. 12, scientific theories are not tentative ideas or hunches. But a lot of these points that they make here, with the exception of some that I take issue with, a lot of these points are valid points, and not only valid but sound.
They're solid, yeah.
And it's just funny how we have these atheists that come onto social media or whatever context, and they proclaim to be talking and arguing in the name of science and reason, whereas they don't understand science, and as a consequence, they also throw reason out the window, because when we're advocating reason, one would be more careful and try and look more at the philosophy of science rather than going out in total ignorance and making yourself look like a fool.
Right, and one of the things I want to point out here is that notice that the link that you referred to was from Indiana University. It's a secular school. I'm sure that article was probably produced. Well, I'm not sure, but it was probably produced by a secularist. The quotes that I've taken earlier that I quoted at length, and I'm sorry about how long they got, but I wanted to get the full context. I quoted from Bertrand Russell and Karl Popper, both of whom are atheists. I haven't quoted any Christians.
I think Karl Popper was agnostic.
Yeah, well, he's not a Christian.
Not a Christian.
Right. So it's not like I'm coming to this thing with an agenda where I'm only quoting our guys. I'm just pointing out merely what the scientists themselves have said, what the philosophers of science themselves have said. I'm not being naive on this. I'm not making this stuff up or pulling it out of my hat. Are there ways that I could say things that could be more clear and avoid? Absolutely. We can always do that. But I think in the main, I've pretty much said about all I want to say as far as it goes right now.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and screen share again, and we'll go ahead and see if we can start getting closer to wrapping this up. Yeah, it's cool how the tree just kind of travels down here. Oh, the mouse does that too. That's pretty neat. I like that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop playing with the infinite number of boxes there and start playing the video again.
If that person were trying to offer some sort of deductive proof of the conclusion, that is, a proof of the conclusion. Now, one could challenge the soundness, the veracity of the conditional premise if one wanted to, but then one would have to enter into an argument about the evidence for and against it. But the form of the argument would nevertheless be valid. There is no fallacy here. But when or why would one construct the first premise the way these apologists have suggested? Well, there is in fact a situation when one would and should construct the first premise as they did, when one is doing hypothesis testing. But hypothesis testing doesn't rely on modus ponens. It relies on a different inference rule called modus tollens. And modus.
Wow, I didn't watch this far. I can't believe you just said that.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, so if
Right.
P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So let's go on. You'll see the example he uses here in a moment.
Okay. Yeah, I can't wait.
Modus tollens is the inference rule that says A implies B, not B, therefore not A. For instance, if there had been an earthquake, my car alarm would have been triggered. My car alarm was not triggered, therefore there was no earthquake. That's a valid form of argument. Modus tollens is the inference rule that we use to describe how we refute or reject a proposition or a hypothesis or a theory. When we devise an experiment, for instance, such as when we say, if hypothesis A is true, we should observe B. When applied to the case of homology and evolution, as the first apologist was describing, it would look like this. If evolution is true, then we'd expect to observe homology in such and such cases. Second premise, we don't observe homology in such and such cases, therefore, evolution is false, not true.
All right, let's stop that. Let's stop that for just a second.
All right.
Totally disagree with that.
Me too.
He said, using modus tollens, the only way that you're going to know if evolution could be true in principle, even if there could be some other mechanism that could be involved. And that's exactly what Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge proposed, was the theory of punctuated equilibrium. They said the reason why you don't observe gradualism in the fossil record, remember what I said earlier? Darwin said that if my theory be true, then you should expect to observe gradualism in the fossil record. In other words, animals going from simplest to most complex as far as their morphological structure is concerned, or their body type and body plans. If we observe gradualism in the fossil record, therefore my theory is true or evolution is true. That's basically the argument that Darwin put forth. The problem is Stephen Jay Gould said, well, obviously Darwin was wrong. There doesn't appear to be this gradualism in the fossil record per his inductive investigation of the rock layers or whatever he studied to determine that. Therefore, he said, evolution's still true, but it happened in huge, fast, rapid leaps, what he called saltations. So they called him a saltationist. Theory of punctuated equilibrium. It's this idea that evolution happened so fast that it was not captured in the fossil record. So just because, if evolution were true, you'd expect to observe homologies. Now, if you don't observe homologies, that does not necessarily mean in principle that evolution is false. So I just wanted to point that out, that, when we talk about the nature of science itself, there are actually examples of this in the scientific literature and in the origins debates that have been addressed and have shown that some of the examples that Ozzy uses, I'm not picking on him, this isn't a personal issue, but this has actually been addressed in the record. So I just wanted to point that out. I thought that would be helpful to listeners.
I thought I read somewhere, and I think it was Wikipedia. I think I saw on Wikipedia that punctuated equilibrium was considered superseded now.
Yeah.
I think it said that. I'm not sure. I mean, these things come and go, like the Big Bang does.
Exactly. Well, the Big Bang is becoming a big dud. I mean, if you've listened to the most recent, and by the way, before I go on, what I'm about to say is you cannot base philosophy and especially your philosophy of Christianity and your theory of origins on scientific deliberations, like some apologists have done, especially with the Kalam cosmological argument. If you listen to one of the latest premier radio broadcasts with Justin Brierley, you have a Christian defending the scientific evidence for the Big Bang. You've got an atheist that's arguing against it. The Big Bang for years has had evidence that's been accumulated. And I've been saying it for years, you cannot use scientific evidence necessarily as a means to try to prove the Christian faith to be true or the claims of Christ to be true. If you do that, you can potentially run into problems later on because the method itself is liable to revision and change because of the nature. And so I just wanted to point that you were alluding to with the not only the punctuated equilibrium, but also with the issue of the Big Bang Theory.
Right, and I would also like to point out something else too. Ozzy's appealing to falsification in the scientific theory, in the scientific method. What we're talking about whenever what you were talking about, Dustin, was people trying to infer the truth of propositions based off of observation,
right?
As what many scientists do, as Charles Darwin did. Like it or not, that's a part of the scientific method.
Right.
Falsification is not the only portion of it. You have to construct theories, and in order to construct theories, you have to be able to build evidence of them. And as we can see with the process of building empirical evidence, it's based on a fallacy, asserting the consequent. So there's a difference between trying to build a case for a theory and then falsifying it.
Right.
So that's just something that, because we're talking about where or not science leads to knowledge. If all science can do is falsify hypotheses, then it's self-evidently true that science doesn't produce any knowledge. Because how can you produce knowledge if all you do is falsify propositions? There's nothing to take us.
That's exactly right.
So there are all kinds of issues with what Ozzy is suggesting here. But whenever I had Dr. Matthew Hunt, you remember him, Dustin?
Oh yeah.
He tried to bring that up to me on one of my blog posts in 2014. He tried to pull the very same thing. So this is something that a lot of atheists are appealing to. But modus ponens, just falsifying theories doesn't. If there's no knowledge is based on belief in that which is true. And right. If you come up with the idea that is false, then it's not knowledge. And someone will say, isn't knowing that something's false is in itself a proposition? Well, you have to assume using induction, which Ozzy already concedes isn't solved. You have to concede that if the problem induction isn't solved, you have no basis for saying that it's false, because you don't know if there may be something that may be favorable that may bring that hypothesis back into prominence, as has happened with the Big Bang several times.
Yep.
So without induction, the modus ponens, using the modus ponens in the scientific method to falsify something, does not lead to any knowledge. And that's the point that we've been making all the time. The best philosophy of science is an operationalist sort of philosophy, where we try and do science and operations for pragmatic benefit, and then also concede that that science cannot bring about knowledge in the epistemological sense. And that's something that I think both you and I hold to. And one thing that's great about operationalism is it allows for flexibility. Even if we know something isn't necessarily true, such as Newtonian physics, on a macro level, we can still use it, even though we know it's not true. If it produces the results we want, then we're going to use it regardless of whether it's true or not. And that happens all the time, because we have Newtonian physics, which was succeeded by general relativity, and then general relativity is currently in a disconnect with quantum physics. But you know what? Even though we cannot reconcile them both, we're still going to use them both if it gets us the results that we're looking for. So I just wanted to bring that up very quickly. Anything else you want to add before I try and get us through the rest of this?
No, I think we can move on.
Cool. All right, here we go. I love watching that.
300
All right.
Time already.
All right, here we go.
This tollens, therefore, is the formal logical description of the principle of falsification or refutability. It's the logical rule which describes the logic or the reasoning behind falsifiability. So is there a circumstance when it would make sense to structure the conditional premise in the following way, which is what the first apologist did? If A, evolution is true, then B, we'd expect to observe homology in such and such cases. Yeah, absolutely. When one is testing that hypothesis to see if one can falsify it, not prove it. And because we do observe homology as predicted by evolution, evolution is not falsified. That is, the facts are consistent with the hypothesis. The hypothesis, based on such an argument, stands unrefuted.
Okay, he missed something here. Did you hear what he said?
Go ahead.
Did you hear what he said? Did you catch his mistake?
Yep.
What did you see?
Go ahead. But I want to make sure I get this right.
Okay.
I want to misrepresent what he said or what I thought I heard him say. Sorry about that.
No worries. You want me to go back some or just keep going?
Yeah, just a little bit. Go ahead and go back just a little bit. I don't want to misrepresent him or misrepresent what I think he said.
So that.
To observe homology in such and such cases. Yeah, absolutely. When one is testing that hypothesis to see if one can falsify it, not prove it. And because we do observe homology as predicted by evolution, evolution is not falsified. That is, the facts are consistent with the hypothesis. The hypothesis, based on such an argument, stands unrefuted. It's not proven true, of course, but science doesn't proceed by proving things true. It proceeds by eliminating and falsifying incorrect hypotheses, resulting in theory rejection or revision. And any theory which stands unfalsified while having been corroborated by correct predictions, where the conditional premises is ordered correctly, not backwards, as these apologists have uncharitably chosen to do, that warrants our provisional assent until it is falsified.
Okay.
Yep, you see that? Did you hear what he did?
Yep. That's the problem.
That was rather uncharitable, Ozzy.
Yeah, well, tell that to the guys that are doing the research on the pickle juice. Because we have research going back and forth saying it does or it does not. It's either true or it's false. As you noted earlier, the law of identity, you don't get it either is or it's not. It's either A or it's non-A. You can't be a little bit A or a little bit non-A. Okay? So provisional assent, I understand what he's saying, but this is the reason why I would reject the idea that we can hold a provisional assent, because either something is true or it's not. Either something is the case or it's not.
Right, and not to mention, he said that we get assent, for belief in evolution based off of observations. Well, no, because the way that you're trying to get assent is by asserting the consequent.
Exactly, and that's the point. This is the only way around. You can put it in modus ponens, you can put it in modus tollens. It doesn't matter. You're going to have to engage in the inductive method. And as Bertrand Russell noted, if this, then that, therefore this. Bertrand Russell rightly pointed out that the inductive method depends upon if P then Q, Q therefore P. There's no way around this.
Yeah, so there's no assent or warrant for evolution based off the empirical method, and not just that.
And that was my point in my original. That was my point. That was my point in my original conversation with the guy. Is that is in principle, based upon the method, the structure of the method that's used is philosophically false. It's logically irrational.
And not to mention,
you can't have warranted true belief, because warranted true belief depends upon the middle component, true. It has to be true. It can't be based on logical fallacies. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupted you a little bit.
Oh, it's okay. But I think that, and Ozzy never specifically said this, so I don't know if he's doing this or not, but it seems like he's sort of drawing from Karl Popper in a sense. Karl Popper, whenever he dealt with the problem of induction, argued that induction is actually a myth, and that science is strictly a deductive method. So it seems to me that it's possible that Ozzy may believe this. If he's arguing that you can come to intellectual assent for believing in evolution based off of these observations, as long as you do it in a valid deductive method, which I think Karl Popper would agree with pretty much everything Ozzy is saying. So in his, but the problem is that the notion that science is strictly a deductive method is just pure fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's why operationalism is really Ozzy's only choice. Either that or skepticism.
Right.
Because science so heavily, any observation is always inductive.
Right.
Any actual extrapolation of that single observation is always inductive.
Yeah. Let me read a couple of things that I got from a paper by Dr. James Anderson titled "Secular Responses to the Problem of Induction." And under the section titled Popper's quote-unquote solution, he says this: In his book, Objective Knowledge, Karl Popper writes, quote, "I may be mistaken, but I think I've solved a major philosophical problem, the problem of induction," end quote. Anderson goes on to comment on this. He says, "Popper is indeed mistaken. At least he is if we take him to be referring here to the problem as set out above, namely the problem. It transpires that Popper actually concedes Hume's position on the problem. The solution he offers pertains to a different problem, one that asks whether past experience can ever justify attributing a truth value, in other words, whether something is true or false, to a scientific theory. Popper argues, rightly, that a scientific theory involving predictions about future instances can indeed be shown to be false by present or past observations. Yet Popper had no reason for thinking that scientific theories can be shown to be true or probably true by present or past observations. Indeed, Popper believes that no such reason can be given, and thus he supplies no comfort to the scientist who has left been wondering after Hume whether she can ever conclude that her empirically based theories are likely to be true, end quote. So Popper didn't answer the solution of the problem. He actually addresses a different problem and thinks that he solved the problem of induction by addressing a different problem. He skirted the issue. So go ahead. I just wanted to point that out because I knew I'd read that years ago and had followed up some on that when I was in seminary. And I found Dr. James Anderson's paper on this to be very helpful in summarizing some of the problems I noticed.
Good stuff. Yeah. And just so we also have the context, I think the contention here, and is whether or not science commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent. That's what the whole question is here between us. But this is the other stuff too, and the reason why I'm wanting to go into this other stuff about the epistemological implications of the scientific method is because some atheists have taken Ozzy's material and showed me the material and then tried to use what Ozzy said to defend the notion that science can lead to knowledge. Right. or warranted belief. It sounds to me, based off of, unless Ozzy misspoke, it sounds to me like he said that science can actually provide justification on the basis of evidence for believing in evolution.
Yeah,
but you see, though, this is how the asserting. What's that?
I was just going to say, yes, it certainly provisional assent. I think that's the terminology that he used. And
this is exactly how asserting the fallacy is committed. I mean, in saying that, he commits the fallacy because there are other reasons why we might observe homology, such as creation, such as design for aliens. There's all kinds of reasons why we might observe homology. So by trying to say that reserving homology is something that we would only expect if evolution were true, commits the fallacy of asserting the consequent. And Ozzy didn't even see that he did it. Right. That's what the fallacy of asserting the consequent does. You assume there's only one antecedent that explains the consequent.
Exactly. Why assume that? Why arbitrarily assume that? Why not assume that it could be just as common? It's not universal ancestry. Maybe it's a universal designer. Maybe it's a common designer. Maybe the reason why we have similar structures within the morphology of animals is because we have a common designer who has a common design plan that he's fulfilling in the world. I mean, I could just as easily. I mean, if we're going to be arbitrary, you know, we can argue that way.
Yeah, and I would say too that I think we have what William Lane Craig would call a knockdown argument here. Whenever Ozzy just tried to explain how the scientific method works in a logically valid way, but despite what he says, unbeknownst to him, perhaps, commits the very fallacy in his defending of the scientific method in which he's trying to say it doesn't commit. And that is a damning thing.
Right.
So you want to go ahead and go on to the rest of the video?
Let's go ahead and finish up.
Yes, because it's getting dark outside and I got places to be.
Me too.
I got a storm coming. It's not good. It's not going to be good convertible weather.
Observe homology, evolution would be falsified. So what these apologists have done here is order the antecedent and consequent of the conditional premise in the way one would express it if one were applying modus tollens so as to test or falsify the hypothesis and not argue for the conclusion. But structured that way, if you apply modus tollens, there's no fallacy. But if you apply modus ponens to the conditional premise as they've constructed it and try to generate a deductive proof using modus ponens, that would be a fallacy. But what scientist or logician presenting an argument for a theory would construct the conditional that way when that's a manifest fallacy? If they were arguing to try to prove the conclusion using modus ponens, they construct the hypothetical condition in exactly the reverse way, as I described earlier. And thus there'd be no fallacy of affirming the consequent when properly constructed. Now, these apologists could still, if they wanted to, challenge the veracity of that premise, of course, the soundness of the argument, but there'd be no formal fallacy. The argument is formally valid if you simply reverse the antecedent and consequent in the first premise.
I want to say something real quick. The proper use of deduction is to prove something. Not to prove that it's probable, not to say that it's likely, but to actually demonstrate something. So if the premises that are being used in deductive argument, and this is assuming Ozzy's position and my position and your position that the problem of induction is solved, if those premises in the deductive argument are supported by a cumulative case. A cumulative case is an example of induction because you say, well, we have good reasons to believe this, not that this is true or that this is demonstratable. So if those deductive syllogisms are supported by a cumulative case, which would be induction, then the argument is automatically unsound because the conclusion would not follow that something is true. Whatever proposition it would be, that proposition is true does not follow from any inductive inquiry.
That's right.
So,
and if you necessarily use induction, you're going to have to invoke the fallacy of asserting the consequent. You have to. Absolutely. If evolution is true, as Darwin said, as I quoted from Darwin earlier, if my theory be true, there should be an innumerable realm or innumerable number of intermediates that prove my theory, namely universal common ancestry. Okay, that's what he set out to do. You can't get away from it. You cannot get away from it. And, this is the nature of the method.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I just said this is the nature of the method. It can't be gotten away from.
Yeah, as a lot of people who watch this video hopefully has learned if they did not already know. All right, we got only 2 minutes left. That means that we can't possibly say much more, right, Dustin?
That's it. Well.
All right, here we go.
Of course, addressing the soundness of a premise in a scientific argument would require that these apologists enter into a discussion about the veracity of the premises, which would be a matter of arguing about the actual evidence. And to do
so, here we go. We're invoking induction, even though he says that problem induction isn't solved. Right there. Just wanted to point that out. Got to be careful, Ozzy.
To that, one has to have actually studied the relevant science so as to be qualified to evaluate the claims made by scientists. One can appreciate the temptation to try this end run around all of that by simply mischaracterizing the nature of the enterprise, so that it seems to be committing an obvious fallacy in a bid to discredit not just evolution, but undermine a confidence in all of science, so as to put it on all fours with a faith-based epistemology of gratuitous presuppositions. Now, it's possible that these gentlemen have encountered people who, in arguing these matters, stated their premises sloppily and thus did get the antecedent and consequent reversed when stating their conditional premise, thus committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent. But any fair-minded apologist, schooled in logic, would acknowledge that avoiding the fallacy is trivially easy by restating the conditional premise in reverse order. And when it was stated in the order that the apologist offered, it's so one can apply modus tollens for hypothesis testing, not modus ponens to try and prove it, and therefore not committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Okay, that's all for now. I hope this helps a bit, and thank you for watching.
All right, so everything he said at the end, basically, we've already responded to. So I didn't see to respond to again. I don't want to be redundant. Is there anything you want to say in closing, Dustin?
No, I just want to say I appreciate everyone that hung in there with us, and I hope that this is useful and beneficial to you as you navigate through these issues. This is no what I'm about to say is no harm to Ozzy or no personal. I don't have any personal vendetta against him. I don't know him or anything of that nature, but I would encourage all who have listened to his video and listened uncritically to actually read Karl Popper, read Albert Einstein, read especially Bertrand Russell when he speaks of the nature of the philosophy of science. Read the atheists, plunder the Egyptians, and they will essentially say the same thing that we've said, that science cannot get you to truth. Really, in my opinion, I'm giving you my opinion now, I don't think science can truth whatsoever, because to have truth, you have to have clear revelation from God. And the only way that we can know that we have capital T truth is if we have a capital T truth giver that gives us that information in a way that comes to us in a clear form. And he's given that to us in Scripture. So there are people that will claim to be ever learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. And I think that in many ways, modern origin science, as it pertains to those that lean in a scientific direction, they're always going to be guilty of this. So that's all I have to say.
Just for sake of clarification, the portion of you saying that it's just your opinion is the proposition that science cannot furnish any knowledge, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so making sure, because some atheist would probably try and come along and say, "Oh, he says that only having knowledge from revelation from God is opinion." So just want to make sure so that we don't have anybody try and put words in your mouth. As far as what I have to say in closing, I don't really have anything personal against Ozzy either, although his accusation of me potentially trying to edit the time that I messaged him is kind of ridiculous. But I don't have anything personal against him. But I have to say, though, if you're teaching philosophy, I hold people who actually teach philosophy to a higher standard than those that are just trying to argue for something and not really trying to teach anything. You know, I mean, people make mistakes. I'm not going to chastise them for it. But when you're in a position where you have a bunch of subscribers and you're teaching them philosophy, you have to be more careful than this.
Right.
Because otherwise you're doing a disservice to the people, to your audience that's watching your videos. So, and these sort of questions have already been answered in scholarship and frankly, on social media as well. So Ozzy, just my advice to you is to be more careful concerning this sort of thing. You cannot say that the problem of induction is not solved and try and invoke induction in your deductive premises to show that something is true or not true. It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
So that's all I really have to say. I hope that this video is edifying to anybody who watched it, be it a Christian or not a Christian. And I'm going to go ahead and get off of here because it's already starting to thunder and lightning and stuff. So I was planning on going out, but I guess I'm going to be waiting for the storm to go away.
There you go. I think we got some coming our way too. So we're supposed to have a men's dinner tonight at our church. So I'm going to head off to that here in a few minutes.
Better get moving.
That's right.
All right, talk to you later, Dustin, and thanks to everybody for watching.